first Parsha. The first Parsha, Mishpatim, is the first Parsha which comes after Aseret Adibros, after the Ten Commandments. Last week it was Parshas Yisroi, and we spoke about the Ten Commandments, the Aseret Adibros, and now we are in Parshas Mishpatim. There's an interesting discussion actually in the commentaries. Where or when was Parshas Mishpatim said? Because if you're going to go to the end of Mishpatim, you're going to find more stories and more details which discusses the day of Matan Torah, the day the Torah was given. Right? That's the last part of Mishpatim. So it looks like that Mishpatim is kind of, somebody's trying to park. Oh. So it looks like that Mishpatim is kind of in between a story which seemingly we already finished. So the commentaries are discussing it when it was said, and the Ramban, Nachmanides, is actually the opinion that Mishpatim was said in the very same day of Matan Torah. It's still a part of the 6th of Sivan. The Ramban actually writes, this is his words, I'm going to translate it into English. He says, the order of the portions, says the Ramban, is proper, ka'ogen, properly organized, because after Matan Torah, at the very same day, Hashem told Moshe the verse which is written in the end of Yisro, Atem reisem ki min hashamayim dibarti imochem, you had seen that I spoke to you from heaven. And then it's mentioned about, again, ensuring that they realize the importance of to stay away from any idol worship. Don't make me any golden idols, any silver idols. And then he continued to tell him also, Eila Mishpatim, Asher Tasim Lifneim, all the psukim in this parsha is all a part of the last verses of last week's parsha, according to Nachmanides, according to Ramban, and it was all said on the day the Torah was given, the 6th of Sivan. Rashi actually is in the opinion that this parsha Mishpatim, God told Moshe only when he walked up back to the mountain to spend the 40 days of receiving the Aseret Adibras, the 10 Commandments. Then is when God shared with them the information which we are reading here in Mishpatim. So basically, according to Rashi, the events which are being discussed in this parsha is actually events which took place it's actually events which took place throughout the 40 days, and they actually happened after the last verses of this Parsha Mishpatim, because at the end of Parsha Mishpatim talks about Moshe going up to the mountain, right? And after, so it's written basically not in an organized manner, which is the famous principle, Ein Mugdel Muchapater. What are you pointing there?
I'm just, this gives the
What is that?
verses also.
What is that?
It's Rashi's opinion of when that.
Okay.
Look
Yeah.
at 6 and 5 and 6.
5 and 6. 5 of Sivan, what?
No.
6th of Sivan?
These numbers.
Okay. Sequence 5. Moshe ascends mountain for 40 days. Is in these verses.
And then 6.
Verse, I see. Okay. Yeah, very good. The civil laws happened between the 40 days, between the 6th of Sivan and the 17th of Tammuz. So I didn't make it up.
No, I know you did.
Thank you very much. No, I saw you watching me. I was wondering if I'm making up some stuff.
No, I'm just keeping ahead of you.
You have to keep ahead of me. You're 200 years older than me. You have to. Okay. So what is the first discussion in this parsha? The first mitzvah that we read in Parshas Mishpatim is about slavery. And the big question that all the commentators are trying to understand, why was that the first? I want to elaborate a little bit on the question, okay? And we're going to see soon why. Parshas Mishpatim begins by describing a situation, as the Torah says, Ki sikne eved ivri, you buy a Hebrew slave. To be a Hebrew slave, according to the Torah, part of it is mentioned here, part of it is mentioned in the book of Leviticus in Parshas Behar. There's two ways a Jew can become a slave. One way is that he is very, very poor and he cannot afford to support his family. So he sells himself as a slave in order to earn some money and to pay bills to support his family. The second, which is a more rare kind of situation, is a Jewish man who went and he stole money. He stole money and he was caught and he has no money to pay back. So then the Beit Din, the court, sells him to us as a slave, and the money which he earns in the work of slavery is being used to pay back the money he stole. This is the only two ways a person can become a slave. Who steals? The one who doesn't have. Actually, last week, we learned about Lo Tachmod. And we saw Lo Tachmod doesn't only mean don't covet or don't desire, but it actually means that you shouldn't desire something, so you shouldn't go ahead and steal it. The Rambam writes, coveting leads to stealing. Stealing leads to murder. So this doesn't have to be necessarily a poor man. If stealing is a result of desiring what somebody else has, you can be a very, very rich man and you still want to have what somebody else has, and that's why you go to steal, right? But here in our case, the simple meaning of this verse is a person who was sold into slavery by the court because he could not repay his theft. So the Torah tells us that there is conditions and limitations on how long he serves as a slave. Shei shonim yavoid, 6 years shall he work. Ubashvis, and on the 7th year, yetze lachof shechinam, he must be released without liability. And then begins a whole discussion in the Torah. What happens if the slave does not want to go free? To the point that we actually bring him to the door, and Midril is here. And the whole idea of drilling the ears to remind them that same here that heard that you should be and you belong to Hashem, ki libnei Yisrael avadim, which is again verses which is talks about slavery. Like I mentioned, the big part of it you're going to find mainly in Parshas Behar, which is in the end of the book of Vayikra, the end of Leviticus, which it says not to enslave him, not to make him work too hard. You are, because all of you are my slaves, and so on. I'm going to mention some of those verses soon. And this is the conditions. And the big question that everybody is wondering, is that the most important mitzvah? You just finished Matan Torah, especially according to the Ramban. It's the same day Moshe is still communicating with God, bringing messages. You finish the Ten Commandments, that's what you come up with. Slavery. The question is even more difficult because it was very rare to consider being sold as a slave at the time when the Jewish people were in the desert. Because if you remember, we spoke a few weeks ago, the loads of money that they all had when they left Egypt. They were having two big distributions of money. One was while being in Egypt during the plague of darkness, when they were told to go and to borrow silver utensils and golden utensils from the Egyptian neighbors. There was one huge distribution. And the second one was at the sea, which we saw 2 weeks ago. The horses of the Egyptians were adorned with jewelry and all kinds of fine, beautiful, expensive stuff. And when they all drowned in the sea spit out their silvers and gold, and the Jews were standing there and collecting to the point, as the Gemara says, there was such an amazing amount of wealth which came out from those loaded horses by the sea. You mentioned the Gemara, you remember that there was 90 or something donkeys that every person was schlepping along the bags and bags of silver and gold. So to have a person who is either poor, that the court has, that he has to sell himself as slavery, or even to consider that he's a ganav, a thief, that we need to sell him as a slave to pay back. Let's say he's a rich man who stole because he desired someone else's money, someone else's car. Even he has enough money to pay it back. And once you pay back, you don't have to work 6 years. You know that. Yeah. Once you pay back, even less than 6 years, the moment you pay back, you're released.
It's more like an indentured servant.
Almost, yes. Actually, matter of fact, in Parshat Behar, the Torah actually does call him kesachir ketashav yeimach. Sachir. In Parshat Behar it says, "V'chiyamuch achicha imach." If your fellow among you becomes needy, this is not a thief. This is somebody who is never needy. Benim karloch, and is being sold to you as a slave. Lo ta'avod ba'avodat eved. Do not make him to work slavery work. We're going to see soon what it means. And then it says, kesachir, keseshav, iye imoch, achnas hayovel yavoid imoch. He should be treated by you like an employee or a hired resident. An employee. It's your slave, but it's an employee.
But if you look at it, this was written while they were in the desert, but it was written for when they go into
But I
Israel
understand it.
and the
But
law.
look, let me give you an example. What was the first commandment they were given last week? Right after the story.
The 10 Commandments?
Right after that. What was the last commandment? The additional commandments last week. Right? You see, go back to verse 19. Hashem tells Moses, the end of last week's Parsha. Tell the Jewish people, you saw that I spoke to you from heaven, right? And then it said, you should not make for yourself Elokei Kesef, Elokei Zov, Leisas Elochem. You should not make for yourself what? What should you not make for yourself?
Silver or gold item.
Exactly. Why were they told that? Because they had a lot of silver. And they had a lot of gold. So they would go and say, okay, let me make the gold and make it my God. What were they told right afterwards? Another additional commandment last week. The only 2 commandments. When you build me an altar, I want you to make it from earth.
No step.
besides the steps, in addition to the steps. Don't make it from expensive items. I don't need your money. And don't think because you have money and you're wealthy, you're going to do and behave the way you behave. No. I'm expecting you to be humble and be careful with all the money you have. And it makes sense, as commentaries actually point out. Why are they being warned against silver and gold right after the, is that like the most important warning? Because they had a lot of silver and a lot of gold. So God felt it necessary that they have to warn it. If they have all the silver or gold, why are you going straight away about slavery? If you're not going to become a slave. You have enough. It's a real commodity. It's a real commodity. It's a real thing to become a slave. The Farkash are asking this question. Ramban, for example, is one of the commentators. When he speaks about this question, he asks this question, what does Ramban say? He says that the mitzvah of Eved Ivri is actually Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. We just left Egypt. And when we left Egypt, we were given the Ten Commandments. What did Hashem say? Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Asher hotzaticha me'eretz Mitzrayim, mibet avadim. I took you out from the house of slavery. Later also in Chumash Bamidbar, what does it say? V'zacharta ki eved ayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. You should remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Vayivdecha Hashem Elokecha, and Hashem had redeemed you. Al ken anochi mitzavcha hadavar hazeh hayom. So it's important to remember that we were slaves. So says the Ramban that the reason why the Torah is commanding us right the first thing with the mitzvah of slavery, because you just came out of Egypt and you remember that you were a slave. So you, by treating the Hebrew slave properly and respectfully with all the conditions that we had mentioned, this is going to serve as a zecher liyetziat Mitzrayim. This is going to be a remembrance of the Exodus, that they came out of slavery. Matter of fact, Ramban says it reminds us the first commandment and also the fourth commandment about Shabbat, because the slave is only 6 years, and the seventh year is redeemed, which is alluding to the 6 days of the week and the seventh day being Shabbos. Talks about the idea that the seventh is an important number. It's not only the Ramban, other commentaries, the famous Sephardic commentator Abarbanel, in his commentary on Mishpatim, he writes also the same thing, because when you finish the commandment, I am Hashem your God who took you out from the house of slavery, right? This is the first commandment. That's the foundation of all the commandments. And he says, by coming out of Egypt, we actually merited to become the servants and the slaves of God. But God says, I took you out from the house of slavery to become my slave. Therefore, it's not fitting that you should enslave others, like we say later in Vayikra, like I read earlier, Ki avadai yem asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim, you are my servant that I took you out to Egypt. So the Ramban says, comes Mishpatim, the book of laws. So the first law is the law of the Hebrewite slave, to remind ourselves that we were just slaves in Egypt, and thank God we were redeemed, and we should not enslave people to us forever. There has to be a time period, a cap, how long it works, 6 years, and then they go home. Zecher levitziat Mitzrayim. And he also mentions another mention, the idea of, which I said earlier, also remembering Shabbat. The 6 years, very in the written 7, also brings that idea of Shabbat. Yeah.
So this, when it says Shvi'it, does it mean the 7th year connected with agriculture, or does it mean just straight count 6 and then the 7th?
No, 6 years from when you hired them as a slave.
Okay, so it's not connected to the Shvi'it of the other.
No. No, it's not like when it comes Shemitah.
No, not actually.
There's an interesting insight given by, I saw Kli Yakar says it, and I saw it in the Kli Yakar, but then I saw that, what was it? Oh, Megala Amukos. Megala, the Kli Yakar, the both rabbis actually, no, the Megala Amukos was in Krakow. The Kli Yakar was in Prague. I was by both of their graves. The Megala Amukos, the Nosson Shapira, he's buried in Krakow. And the Kli Yakar is married next to the Maral, one next to each other in the old cemetery of Prague. But they both say the same idea. He says actually he says actually something very sharp, but very more to the point. They say that the Torah wants to actually remind us the danger by enslaving a Jew as a slave. Why? Because the entire galut of Mitzrayim, the exile of Egypt, happened because the enslavement of a Jewish boy. What happened? The brothers of Yosef took away from him his freedom. They sold him as a slave to Paro. Matter of fact, he said it's interesting. The Torah says over here, "Kitikne Eved Ivri," a Hebrew slave. We are not called Hebrew at all in the Torah. Avraham was called Avraham Ivri because it means he was from the other side. The old world was outside of the river. The old world was in one place. He was in the other side. But we are never called Hebrews. We are called Bnei Israel. But we're not called Hebrews. Why does it say Kitikne Eved Ivri? When it comes to a slave, the Torah uses specifically the term the Hebrew slave. Well, what's the point of a Hebrew slave?
It's a hint.
Because it's leading us to Yosef. And Yosef, in the entire story, keeps on being referred to as the Hebrew boy, right? Veshavitanu, the baker says, Veshavitanu nar ivri. There is a Hebrew man. Potiphar's wife tells the husband, Eveta lanu ish ivri. You brought a Hebrew man to joke with us, to mock with us. So that the title Hebrew is again strengthening that relationship to Yosef and what we spoke about. And basically, they sold him to Egypt as a slave to Egypt. And that resulted to the fact that we all had to end up eventually in Egypt. That brought the whole exile of Egypt. So basically, by taking away the freedom from the one Hebrew, led the entire Jewish people into slavery. That we all became slaves to Pharaoh, after Pharaoh. Says the Kli Yakar, says the Megala Amukos, they both say, this is where the Torah begins. Coming out of Egypt, just be careful with slaves, because when you are a master and you have someone working for you, be careful how you treat them, because the way you treated the once a slave, you ended up in Egypt. This is what the Megala Amukos says. And the Kli Yakar actually says the same thing. The Kli Yakar says the same thing, actually. And he brings that, he says even more the Kli Yakar. The Kli Yakar says, he says even more actually. He says, look at that. We're talking about a slave who was sold because of stealing, right? That's what the context of this verse is. It says the Kli Yakar God tells the Jewish people, you were also sold to Egypt because you stole, you kidnapped. Who did we kidnap? Yosef. So you stole, and you ended up in Egypt because of that. I sold you to the Egyptians, and nevertheless, you left eventually. So here too, says the Kli Yakar, you stole, the guy stole, he ended up being a slave, but give him a break. Enough is enough. There is a time for everything. This is what the Kli Yakar says. So this is generally what commentators are discussing, the idea of why the Torah begins with this mitzvah, the mitzvah of Eved Ivri. And this, little, they call it the irony of the matter is that when we speak today about slavery, it seems something which is so far from our reality. We don't have slaves, we don't know what it means to be a slave. But not too many years ago, what was that, 150 years ago, maybe, that here in the United States of America, there was a famous civil war, which was led by President Lincoln. And what was President Lincoln trying to do? He tried to stop slavery. There were a number of states in the South which didn't want to stop. They brought people from South Africa or from different places, which they were literally working as slaves. Slaves means the people had no freedom, without the Jewish conditions of slaves. And it led to a civil war, people died, the president himself was shot to death, right? And that brought the end of slavery. But you look at it and you think that it was a possibility not so many years ago. Okay? Not so many years ago.
It even ended later in some of the other countries.
They still have.
Slavery.
It's still
Sure.
resistant.
Yeah. But we were one of the first countries.
Right. Today it's less common, obviously. For Jews to enslave someone, what's the rules of enslaving someone? It's very interesting.
They have to be fed first. They have to be fed.
So there's a famous Gemara. The Gemara says in Kedushin, this is what the Gemara says it, right? It's brought on in the Rambam. Basically, the fact that the verse writes that when you have a slave, the verse that you mentioned earlier, the verse in Parshat Be'ar, right? The verse says that he should live with you. Gemara in Kedushin. Oh, says the Gemara. It says in the verse, "Kitov lo imach." It says that a Jewish servant who wishes to become a nirtza, he wants to become drilled, right, in his ear.
Right here.
Okay, so in the Deuteronomy, the way the verse described it, that the servant desires to remain with his master. Okay, so it says, Kitov lo imach, because it is good for him. It has been good for him with you. Why was it so good for him? So it's not just a story about one slave. It happens to be that he had a good time by his master. The Talmud tells us that this is the requirements of a slave. That when you have a person and a servant, you must make sure that it's good for him with you. Says the Gemara, this teaches us that the servant should be with you, imach, in food, and with you in drink, which means to say the Talmud is very specific. It should not be that you eat bread made of fine flour, and he eats bread made of inferior flour. No, if you eat fine flour, that's the kind of bread you have to feed him. And it should not be that he drinks wine, he drinks new wine, and you drink aged wine. Aged wine is tastier than new wine. No, if you drink aged wine, it's called yain yashan, then he has to be offered the aged wine. And the Gemara continues, Ata yashen al gabei muchim. It should not be that you sleep on top of soft mattresses. Vehu yashen al gabei teven, and he sleeps on top of straw. To the point that the Talmud makes a very strong statement, like Elisha's mentioned it before. Mikan amru, on this account is what our rabbis taught us. Kol hakoneh eved ivri, kekoneh adon leatzmo. Anyone who buys a Jewish servant as virtually he bought a master for himself.
When also, if he, at the end of 6 years, he had been given a non-Jewish wife, and he had children, he has to leave them there, so that might be a reason why he wants to stay.
Whatever it is, yeah. But listen to Tosfos. Tosfos says even more. Tosfos has a good question. Tosfos asks, what's the meaning? I'm buying a slave, I'm buying a master on myself. It's not a master. I have to give him what I have. So we are equal. Equal doesn't make him the master.
Yes, sir.
If you have one pillow, that is good.
So that's what Tosfos says. Tosfos says, because of the pillow. That's what Tosfos says. If you have one pillow, you can't you can't use it and not give it to him, because then it's not imach, it's not equally to you. Neither of you to sleep with it, says Tosfos. That's called asdoimiyad behavior. Not me, not you. That's dumb. Says the Talmud Yerushalmi, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to give it to him. So that's the meaning of he becomes a master to you. He's getting even more than what you. And in the Rambam, in the laws of slavery, is very clear and very strict how much and how little you may actually allow to work your slave. You can't even take you close to the bathhouse, because that's a disgracing kind of service. Then what does he do? I was wondering, all the things that we are told that you cannot do. So at what point is it called a slave? Like what makes it into a slave? It's almost like there is nothing there.
Except he can't leave.
What?
Except he can't leave. That's the only part of his slavery is that
So what does it tell you?
for at least for 6 years.
What does it tell you? Very interesting, actually, if you think about it.
Tells you to sell yourself as a slave.
No, what does it tell you about what's the definition of a slave? The Rambam says like this. Let me read you the Rambam. This is already besides what we spoke till now, that what you have to provide them. In chapter 1, Halacha 7 says the Rambam, whenever a Jew purchases a Hebrew servant, he may not make him perform, it's being called debasing tasks. Debasing tasks mean things which embarrass him or I don't know, that are that are um, regulated only for servants. This you cannot have your Hebrew servant do for you. What's the example, says the Rambam? To have him carry his clothes to the bathhouse. You cannot do that. Removing your shoes. And he brings the verse because it says, Lo ta'avod ba'avodat eved. Do not have him serve slavery tasks. Instead, it says, Kesachir ketoshav yiro. I mentioned earlier. Kesachir ketoshav yeimach. He should be considered like a hired labor, like an employee. It says, it's permitted to have the servant cut the master's hair, launder his clothes, and take his dough. But you cannot make him the manager of a public bathhouse, or a public barber, or a public baker. And the Rambam says, a Hebrew servant, his self-image is depressed because of his being sold. Nafsho shfeila b'mechira. And therefore, if he was sold to you, like this is the context of this parsha, so as it is, his spirit is very down, and we have to be very careful how we treat him. Later, he brings the idea of kof tov lo'imor, the bread, the wine, the pillow. He has to live in the same neighborhood. And he says the statement that we mentioned, Akoneh v'nivri koneh adam le'atzmo. And he says, Chayav lin'og bo minag achva. It's also, you must regard them, your brother. You have to live with them with brotherly love, Maimonides says. Brotherly love. He has to sit at all the family parties, in all the family meetings. He brings the verse about Israel. The servant, he says, whatever job he has, he should do it like a servant. But you think about it, like David said, but it's very interesting that when you think about this whole concept of slavery, with all the conditions that we just read from the Gemara, from the Rambam, there's one thing that the slave doesn't have. His own free time. I don't mean free. Even things that he wants to do, he cannot do it at the time that he wants. At every given moment, I can tell him, now do this. The non-embarrassing work, let's say. He wants 3 o'clock to go and study Rambam, the slave. 3 o'clock, I decide as the master, I need you to pick up my kids from school. That's what a slave is. He has to follow. The idea of not to have time at all, not to have anything personally that you can express and your own time, this is what a slave is. No free choice.
Didn't we read a couple of weeks ago, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, that Shem tells us that we are all Kohanim, priests,
Right.
holy people.
Right.
So how can we then take one of us and try to lower him when we are really at the same level? to Hashem?
Not lowering him. Exactly. You can make him work because he has to
But I meant
pay his
treat
money.
him
But
as
you
a-
have to treat him with respect
Yeah,
because
because
he's
he-
holy. Exactly. It
not
doesn't
equal
make him.
to-
It doesn't make him less
He's
holy.
equal to us.
It doesn't make him less holy.
Definition between Jew, slave, Jew, slave, free. Free Jew can make a free choice. Slave cannot make a free choice.
Exactly. There's no freedom. That's he looks using freedom, even though you're getting the best food, just like the master, and you even being treated better than the master. The one pillow you're gonna end up getting, and when you walk on the street, no one thinks that you're the servant because you're not even schlepping your stuff. Maybe you even master schlepping is, right? like there's nothing there. But he doesn't have a spirit.
You gotta hire a non-Jewish slave to take.
So really, if you think about it, that's what I want to comment that is to the following point. And I saw this insight being mentioned again by Meir Shapira, the Rabbi of Lublin, in the book I have over here, or Meir. He actually the one who points it out. He says that we always call Mishpatim the rational commandments. Right? We all know there's the famous breakdown of commandment, the mitzvah makes sense, like honoring parents, not to steal, the mitzvahs which are beyond any rationale, mixing meat and milk, mixing wool and linen, right? We call it hukim. Rashi tells us right at the beginning of the Parsha that the Parsha begins with the letter Vav. Ve'ele mishpatim. What is ve'ele? And so this goes back to the ones came before them. Just like the ones before them came directly from God from Sinai. So you should know that all these other laws, even though they seem rational, monetary responsibilities, obligations, and communal obligations, and protection of property, and so on, everything which is being discussed in this parsha, but you should know that ultimately they are from Sinai. So when you think about it, it's not just they are from Sinai. The idea is that we are to do even the rational commandments because God told us to do them. That's the old message. They all came from Sinai, right? They're all rational, but we're not performing them because of their rationale. We are performing them because God told us to do those mitzvahs. Ve'ela mishpatim. So it could be, and this is I think Meir Shapira is the Rabbi of Rabbi is saying, the laws of slavery present you with that mix. In one is it a rational mitzvah. You just came out of Egypt. You know what it means to be a slave. Don't treat him in a slave conduct. He's a nebuch. He had to be sold. He doesn't know. He doesn't have. Whatever, it makes sense. Don't keep him more than 6 years. Make sure he has his life back to himself. So it seems very rational, very humane. But at the same time, when you consider all those conditions that we just read, this is a twist of godliness in a rational mitzvah. Because it doesn't make sense when you have a slave to give him the same food that I eat. I'm sure that all the slaves who were in the South did not eat the dinner
aged wine,
aged wine or aged meat which their masters were eating at the same time. They gave him some straw. They gave him some nothing. Daisa, kasha, whatever it is, cereal, herring, I don't know. That's what they gave them. Comes the Torah and puts the slave on a, you call it on a pedestal. On a pedestal. On a pedestal. That's what I wanted to say. Like, so that's a twist of chok. It's not really rational completely. So the Torah brings out this concept of mishpatim, but not just mishpatim. Ve'ela mishpatim. To track these laws back to Sinai, there's specifically necessarily with this concept of Eved, because Eved, those carry these two elements of a mitzvah. You see a mitzvah which is rational, but clearly a reflection of Sinai. I believe that's what the Meir Shapiro is saying. Yeah. And this is the book called Imrei Dat. Yeah, this is what it says. I'm going to read you what it says. It was the Rabbi of Lublin. He was the founder of the Daf Yomi, famous learning page that a lot of people are studying a page of Talmud. He was one of the leading rabbis in Poland before the war. So he says it's famous that the words of the mitzvahs of the Torah have the two segments. There are those rational laws, and there are those which are not so rational. And then he brings from great rabbis which said that even the Mishpatim, even the rational ones, we should do them not because we understand them and we came to the conclusion that we should do them, but rather because it is a law, a decree by God, and therefore we have to accept it without second thoughts. What is the example for that? That even a rational law should be according to with a twist of godliness. So he says, take the example of Eved Ivri, and he brings the Gemara and the Tosfot that we just mentioned earlier about the one pillar. So he says, would human rationale expect from a person to give the one pillar you have to your slave, to be required to give it to your slave? Absolutely not. That means that even in a rational mitzvah, we don't understand what God wants from us. We can only follow. That's Ve'ela. First came from Sinai, and every of the Mishpatim came from Sinai. What's the proof that everything came from Sinai? Is this very mitzvah, Ki tikneh eved ivri. That's why the way it goes. Ve'ela Mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. Just like the first came from Sinai, this is also from Sinai. Ki tikneh eved ivri is the proof that everything came from Sinai, because he has such a unusual mitzvah called Ki tikneh, how to treat a what's it called? How to treat a servant. Very nice. You know, the Meir Shapiro says. In Hasidus, actually, this is what's being discussed. The Rebbe speaks about the Ma'amorim, that the whole idea of Torah starting with Kitei Knev and Ivri is because that's is the approach that a Jew needs to have to Torah and to Yiddishkeit, to Judaism. We are servants of God. We are servants of God. Nasa v'nishma. We are servants to follow and to obey, even when it doesn't necessarily make sense to us, even when we don't understand. That's what the idea of a servant is. Right? Anoichi Hashem Elokecha asher asiro ki li bnei Yisrael avodim. You are my servants. I remember once there was a Fabringen. It wasn't necessarily a Fabringen, it was a Sheva Brachot, one of the sons of the Rebbe's secretary. His name was Rabbi Binyamin Klein. And he never spoke. He was like the ultimate silent box. You couldn't get anything out of him. Obviously, that's what made him the secretary. He was the type of person who kept a secret that you didn't know that he has a secret. Sometimes there are people, I have a secret, I'm not going to tell you. And they don't tell you. They're very stubborn. And they don't tell you, but everybody knows that they have a secret. And then there's the other type of person that not only keeps a secret, that nobody even knows that he has a secret. He could have talked to you, he had no idea what he knows and what he heard. And it was his son, Sheva Brachot, in the Shiva studio, kind of pressing him to say something, something he experienced personally with the Rebbe that we don't, things that we don't see. He also used to drive the Rebbe to the mikveh, and then he used to go to the mikveh before going to the oil, or other occasions. He was the driver. Sometimes he used to pick up the Rebbe in the morning from the house, bring him to 770. A devoted servant. He was from Jerusalem. And so after pushing him for a while, that's the following is what he said. He said, I want to tell you something about our Rebbe. That sometimes I'm in the car and the Rebbe talks to me. In my mind, I'm like thinking, okay, that's probably the direction where the conversation is going. And lo and behold, it takes such a twist, and such a turn, and such a direction that I would have never imagined that that would be the reaction, the response, the comment to whatever the Rebbe was talking about. Completely unexpected. But he said the following. He says, listen, guys, I want to tell you how extreme this idea is. Imagine, he said, you are standing in a dirty room, messy, dirty, loaded on the floor, and the Rebbe comes in and he tells you, Elisha, take a broom. What would you do? And do what?
Never.
That was his point. The Rebbe tells you take a broom, don't do nothing. But you don't know what's the next. What is the next step once you have the broom in your hand? I don't know.
Give it to the owner.
You don't know. You just don't know. So you're standing in the room. Don't say 1 plus 1 is 2. Since the room is messy and dirty. And here is when the Rebbe asked you to take a broom. So it must be that what does he expect me to do? He wants me to clean. And this is all good when you talk in when you talk about human conduct, when you talk about the people, human beings within themselves. But when it comes to that is it's above. You don't know. You just don't know. So that's exactly what the Torah is telling us. Eila Mishpatim, these are the laws. כי תקנה ונבריא, 6 שנים יעבוד. Okay, sounds so simple. Well, let me give you some insight. Small. You have black bread and white bread. He gets the white bread. Okay, whatever you prefer.
Healthier.
It's what he prefers, not what the master prefers. It's what he, the servant, prefers. It's the blanket. It's the pillow. It's the food. It's the wine. It's the area of living. I don't want to live downtown. I want to live uptown with you. You don't have him work by you in the morning and then you send them to a shelter in downtown for 3 hours on a bus until he gets back to who knows where, to his apartment if he got by someone. No. This is called chok. And this is the foundation of Torah. The foundation of Torah is to relate to all the mitzvahs, like a Eved. Eved Avram Anoichi. What did Eliezer tell Lavan when he met with them? Who are you? He didn't say, I'm an accountant, I'm a rabbi, I'm a dentist, I'm a gabbai, I'm a this, I'm a that. First thing, you know who I am? I am the servant of Avram. That's what Eliezer said. That's the biggest statement about Eliezer. Introducing himself as Eved Avraham. Imagine Eved Hashem. Somebody can get up there and say, who are you? Eved Hashem Anoich. I am the servant of God. That's it. Take it from here. That's what the first mitzvah is.
Big responsibility.
What?
Big responsibility.
Oh Hashem. God expects from us big stuff. He trusts us, I guess. He believes in us, I guess.
Where he chose us as a
So-
people.
What?
That's why he chose us and not
Exactly.
another nation.
We can say we are Evet Hashem.
You should say. That's the goal. The goal is to be a Eved Hashem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy it. This is one shiur. We're having another shiur coming afterwards. This
Oh,
was the
8:30
English
I
class.
thought.
7:30 is Parshat Shavua class.
Okay, and 8:30.
8:30 is Hebrew-speaking Talmud class.
Okay. I didn't know that, but I learned something every day.
גם זו לטובה.
I'm sorry?
גם
Yeah,
זו
yeah.
לטובה.
Okay. No, I thought we kind of discussing before the class. I didn't know
No,
that.
we just finished an hour class. Welcome.
Oh, great.
Thank you very much, everybody. This class, I'm now leaving the